This nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men
are created equal.
I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. I mean, really, no fear.
Created equal.
From WDET in Detroit, this is Created Equal. I'm Stephen Henderson, and it's time for our weekly recap show. I'm in the studio with our producer, Carrie Jr. II.
Weekly recap. We're going to go with different...
See, I like that theme.
Just the
Yeah, right. We could have like an old style news kind of theme, right? Yeah, right. It just kind of fades up, then fades down.
That would be kind of fun. I actually kind of like that. That's fun.
Yeah. I'm in favor.
All right.
So we had a big week in the news this week. Vice President Kamala Harris named Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota to be her vice presidential pick for her run for president in 2024. We talked about that, but we talked about it in an interesting way, I think, in the context of women in politics and the barriers that they still face. We also noted a milestone here in Southeast Michigan of the 50th anniversary of Milliken v. Bradley, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case that ended busing as a tool, forced busing as a tool for school integration in the 1970s. It, of course, originated here in Detroit and Michigan, but it had implications nationwide. And we had a conversation about another milestone, this over-the-counter birth control pill that has been developed, which gives all kinds of women new access to control their reproductive health. But, of course, it comes at a time when states have more power than they have in 50 years to infringe on that reproductive freedom.
Yeah, and let's just hop right into that segment, too. We spoke with Dr. Meredith Field. She's an assistant professor in the Division of Social Sciences at Alfred University in New York. She's also a board member of National Women's Health Network and a medical sociologist specializing in issues of access and equity in health and medicine. So a perfect person to weigh in on this because this over-the-counter birth control pill, this old pill, as you said, it gives access to folks like young adults and adolescents, people who are uninsured, people who are living in contraceptive deserts who may not have access to this type of care and want to make choices about their own bodies and activities. It was recently approved to be released in the spring of this year.
Yep.
It was approved last year in 2023. And so we did have a moment in the conversation, I don't know if this in the segment, where we talked about where's male birth control? You know, for a second
right?
we did bring that up.
No one's talking about the need for that.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to bring that around.
Yeah.
But for right now, let's listen to what Dr. Field had to say.
Dr. Field, I want to start here talking about that the access to birth control goes beyond providers, that we also have an issue in some cases with pharmacies. They are able to refuse to fill contraceptive prescriptions or provide emergency contraception and or refuse to stock contraceptives. We talked about OBGYN deserts. There are also kind of contraceptive deserts. Isn't that right?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, part of this relates to some of the Supreme Court cases that were looking at religious organizations who were employers having the ability to get a religious exemption, right, to not cover certain reproductive health care. And now we have individual pharmacists and certain pharmacy companies that are also saying, we don't have to do this. This doesn't align with our beliefs, and they can get religious exemption. So that creates more of a desert for contraceptives. I mean, we have this similar kind of thing happening in terms of maternal health care, where there are places that hospitals have closed and the only hospital left is a Catholic hospital that won't provide certain kinds of reproductive health care. So the issue of religious exemptions and religious freedom in the U.S. Intersecting with reproductive health care does further limit access and makes it almost impossible for people in certain areas to get care.
And as we were discussing with OBGYN deserts and other access issues, race and, of course, income have a lot to do with this as well. Why are women of color, for instance, more likely to live in these contraceptive deserts?
Yeah, so there are a number of factors that play into it. I mean, part of it goes back to segregation in cities. And one of my favorite books that I use in teaching is The Death Gap, which is written by a physician in Chicago who worked in hospitals in different parts of the city. And he does an amazing job of outlining the very different levels of healthcare, amount of healthcare, access to organ donation in different neighborhoods based on race. You can see that the white neighborhoods have much better healthcare and more access to contraceptives, all the medications, than people in Black and Latinx neighborhoods, for example. So we've got segregation of cities as part of it. We have the intersections of class, the wealth gap happening in the U.S., right? So lots of pieces to it.
I also want to spend just a little time going back in history a bit to talk about why we continue to have some of these arguments about women's reproductive freedom. As I said in the open of the show, I actually had the number wrong. I said we're about 70 years from the Supreme Court essentially trying to wrest the issue of reproductive freedom away from the government and give it to physicians and to women. Griswold v. Connecticut is the ruling. It's 1965, not 1955, so it's more like 60 years and not 70. Still, that's a long time to have been having this argument, and it has sort of ebbed and flowed. It's gone in one direction pretty quickly, and then kind of been pulled back in the other. But talk about that ruling, why it was so important, and I guess why it hasn't had, I think, the effect that might have been predicted from it, which would have been that the government just can't interfere in these issues in quite the way that some people still want it to.
Yeah, so that ruling was important because it was basically saying that the U.S. government should stay out of people's marriages, stay out of people's private conversations with their healthcare providers, and they should be able to make these decisions about their family planning, especially. But we have a legal system and a court system that is not impartial, right? Is not bipartisan. And so as the pendulum swings in our kind of national political stage and the Supreme Court shifts, we take advantage. Different groups of people, different special interest groups take advantage of the moment, the cultural context, to say, hey, this is a moment where we could push our agenda and potentially get some traction on this. It is very intertwined with the kind of religious and moral founding of this country and the kind of power that the founding people, white men, had, and their interests and wanting to maintain their power, to be perfectly honest. So the more that the people in power can control the reproduction of and the health care decisions and the health of the people that they want to control, the more their power is sustained, right?
Yeah. Again, 313-577-1019 is the number here on the phones. Call and tell us if you're someone who's going to take advantage of the O-pill, the new and first ever over-the-counter birth control pill available here in the United States. Also give us a sense of how your relationship with your physician has gone with regard to reproductive health. Have you found challenges to obtaining contraceptives for instance, in the past, either from your physician or a pharmacy or some other institution that is involved in reproductive freedom? Again, 313-577-1019. You can also go to Twitter and hashtag Created Equal or at WDET. Let's start today with Janet in Dearborn. Janet, welcome to the show.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi.
I just wanted to say that I'm super excited about this. This is going to be huge for women. Like, it's a wonderful step forward. But I wanted your guest to just touch on the side effects of the progesterone pill. I don't really know that much about it, but I am concerned about how the medical community kind of downplays a lot of women's experience of side effects or education in that area. And then also to touch on the movement forward for men's birth control as well, because I feel like past that, that's like the next step. So super excited and proud to be having this conversation today, but also thinking about moving forward too.
Yeah. Jen, I really appreciate the call. Great questions, both of them. That first question, Dr. Field, about the side effects. Talk about the side effects of, I guess, this new pill versus the side effects of the old one. They are different, correct?
Yeah, they are different. And so one of the things that makes this pill safer for most people is that it's a progestin-only pill. And so traditionally, many hormonal birth control pills are a combination of estrogen and progestin. And that combination, and especially the estrogen, can make it more dangerous for people with pre-existing conditions like high blood pressure or diabetes, people who smoke. So the progestin-only pill is actually considered to be much safer. And I think that's a real positive too, right? That we're getting out a safer pill over the counter. Of course, anytime we alter the hormone levels in our bodies, there's some risk associated with that. And that's something that has been discussed in terms of birth control, in terms of hormone replacement therapy for people who are in perimenopause, the risk that shift between perimenopause and menopause. But again, this is progestin only. And so the main thing that they've seen in some people using it is some irregular spotting, but it's really a gentler way of providing hormonal contraception than a combination pill.
Yeah. And so one question I think would also be about if you're able to get it over the counter, you still need a physician, right, to make sure that you're not suffering from any other side effects and things like that. In other words, just the fact that it's over the counter doesn't say that you don't need somebody to help manage the use of it.
Yeah, it's always important to have a provider who you trust. This is one of the tragic things about the healthcare system in the U.S. right now, that we have a shortage of providers. But just having somebody you can trust, because there are also people who are at higher risk when they're using any sort of hormones, including people that have liver diseases or if they have a history of breast cancer. So, yes, it's absolutely important to, even if you can't, for some reason, access a provider, do your own research, right? And unfortunately, we live in a world and a time when we really have to be our own best advocates. And so while it's ideal to have a provider, that's not possible for everyone.
Yeah. Let's go to Janet's second question, which is about the male birth control pill, the fictional for now idea of a male birth control pill. I have a lot of women friends who have, made much of the idea that there's not even a product to try in that regard, and that the burden sits firmly on women. Are we anywhere with the idea of a pill that guys could take that would prevent pregnancy?
Yeah, some of my colleagues are working on trials of different types of birth control for males, and we are making progress. The biggest hurdle that we need to overcome is the stigma surrounding this, the fear that using male birth control could affect your masculinity negatively, could affect your virility, right? Mm-hmm. All of the things that we associate with being masculine traditionally. So it's a real, I think, kind of culture shift that we have to work on. Some of the things that have been tested in clinical trials on humans, there's just been too many complaints of side effects like headaches or fatigue. And these are things that people with uteruses who take hormonal birth control are dealing with all the time, right? We're kind of used to it because we have been forced to take on that burden because there wasn't an option for males. So we are making progress, but I think a lot of it is kind of like a resocialization of how we think about masculinity and understanding that taking the male pill, if it existed, is not going to make you less of a man.
Yeah.
So that's definitely an important piece. People are working on it. I love to have that conversation with my students in some of my classes. And one of the things that I think we forget is that not only is the burden primarily on people with uteruses right now to handle contraceptives, but it also means that people with penises have to rely on those people, right? I would think that would be scary too, that you don't have as much control over the family planning and contraception in a sexual relationship. So
an awful lot of trust that would be involved there.
Yeah.
That was my conversation with Dr. Meredith Field, an assistant professor in the Division of Social Sciences at Alfred University in New York, about the OTC birth control pill. Coming up next, we're going to listen back to a conversation about women in politics, a really current subject given that Vice President Kamala Harris is likely to be the Democratic nominee for president in 2024. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. We're back with more Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and here with Carrie Jr. II, our producer. Up next, we're going to go back to a conversation we just had about women in politics, and it was a really well-timed show. Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, presumptive Democratic nominee for president, named her VP pick, Tim Walz of Minnesota, and then was here in Michigan on Wednesday evening. 15,000 people showed up at Metro Airport to take a look at her and Tim Walz. And then the next day, we talked about women in politics and the barriers that they still face.
I remember all the media narratives talking about how Vice President Harris was evaluating white men as potential vice presidential candidates. She ended up choosing a white man. It does underscore a perception that we may have around whether we believe a female ticket, a completely female ticket, could win. And this discussion is really about evaluating those kind of perceptions that we have as a country and asking whether or not Vice President Harris's campaign is slowly chipping away at that.
Yeah, and what does that mean for other women? What does that mean for younger women in politics? What does that mean for people running for offices that are not quite as high as President of the United States? We really got to all of those questions in this conversation.
Yep, and we had three really, really knowledgeable guests to speak to that. We had Ali Vitale, the Capitol Hill correspondent for NBC News and the author of the book Electable: Why America Hasn't Put a Woman in the White House Yet. We also had Kathy Weininger. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Western Washington University. Her research explores political representation at the intersection of gender, race, and partisanship. And then we had Kimberly Peeler-Allen, who's a visiting practitioner at the Center for American Women and Politics at Rutgers University. That organization's mission is to promote kind of greater knowledge and understanding about the role of women in American politics. So a nice they all had really good things to say.
They all had great perspective on this.
I feel like the conversation could have gone on much longer if we wanted it to.
Okay, Ali, Kathy, and Kimberly, before we get to our listeners, I want to talk about the VP pick here for Kamala Harris. And I think what that means to gender politics. Our governor here in Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, was somebody who was, of course, mentioned many times as a potential running mate for Kamala Harris. And I kept saying, well, boy, it would be a real risk to put two women on the ticket, given the historic barriers, right? Given the way that people might react to that. It would make gender more of the focus of the campaign, and I'm not sure that it made sense to take that kind of gamble. In the end, Kamala Harris picks Tim Walz, who is an older white male from Minnesota, far more prototypical, at least in the demographic sense, of the kind of people we've seen on presidential tickets in the past. So in a way, I kind of feel like maybe this is a sign that things haven't changed all that much, that while you have a woman at the top of the ticket, she still has to play some of the gender politics that dominate our political structure. So when I get the three of you talking about what that means, is this a sign of lingering sexism? Is it a lingering sexism even that I was indulging by saying I didn't think Gretchen Whitmer had a shot at something like this? What do we make of Tim Walz? Who wants to go first?
I'll start. I mean,
Okay.
I'll just say it also struck me that on our network and other networks, when you looked at the graphics of the possible vice presidential contenders, most of them looked the same. And that was on purpose. I mean, I do think that while I try to look at the upshot and the optimistic point of view about reflective governance and where women are in politics right now, the reality of Kamala Harris being at the top of the ticket is that they knew that they needed to find someone who could be a counterbalance to her in many ways, both politically, geographically, and then also in terms of the identity politics and the role that race and gender will play out on the campaign trail. The thing I think of first, and the comparison point that was brought to me first by many operatives that I talked to about this, was this is also the same kind of game that Barack Obama had to play when he chose Joe Biden,
Yes.
who was a graybeard on foreign policy, but who also didn't carry the burden of race, in the words of one of Obama's advisors to me, in the same way that Obama himself did. So Harris is in a familiar place, not just to Obama, but also to Hillary Clinton, who, when I talked to her for my book Electable, I asked her about the prospect of when she was considering Elizabeth Warren as a vice presidential contender and what the output of two women on the ticket would have been. And she called it an upside downside and said it would be energizing and historic. And there were advisors who wanted her to lean into that. But at the same time, she also had the concerns that I know many Democrats have voiced to me, which is that you don't as much as there is progress right now, there are also people who are reluctant to leaning into that progress in the same kind of energetic way that some Democrats might want them to. Yeah. And so with the Tim Walz pick, there are so many reasons for this, but one of them that really stuck out to me in the reporting was the role of ambition. And I think for people like Kimberly and Kathy and I who watched the role of gender in politics, back in 2020, Kamala Harris was pegged in a bad way for being ambitious, as if all politicians aren't ambitious in the first place. But the idea that Walz came into the room for their Sunday meetings and basically reportedly said, you know, this is the end of my career. I'm here to amplify you. I'm here to help you win. I mean, that is the role of ambition when you're looking for any vice president too. So I think just turning over the different ways and reasons why Walz ended up being the VP, yes, there are gender and racial aspects to it, but of course, politics and all of the rest of that is so part and parcel to it too.
Yeah. Kathy or Kimberly, what do you make of Tim Walz here?
I think he was a very strategic choice, and for all the reasons that Allie laid out. And I think, as we're talking about the upside of having the vice president at the top of the ticket, there is also the counterbalance of that of, if she does not win, what does that mean for other women who want to run? And I think the campaign is very committed, as the vice president has talked about, throughout her career, that her mother, made her commit to the very beginning that you may be the very first to do a lot of things, but make sure you're not the last. And I think, the vice president was thinking very strategically about, how do I, set this up so that, I am successful and I'm able to, help bring other people along and open the door for other women. And picking Governor Walz, I think, was a very strategic move in that endeavor, that it helps her make sure that she will be successful, and that people will look at women's leadership in a different way that helps seed the ground for others. So I think there's there's a lot at play in all of this. There's I think there are a lot of conversations about what kind of coattails the vice president will have. What does her being at the top of the ticket mean? And it's, for some, people are concerned that there will be heightened scrutiny on them, even more scrutiny on them as women candidates, because the vice president is a woman, and a misstep by her is seen as a complete catastrophe for others. So there is that ripple effect that I think every step that the campaign makes, they are also thinking not just about their own race, but what this means for governance and representative democracy in the future.
Yeah. Kathy, I'm curious about your sense of having, or whether Kamala Harris had to pick a white man to be her running mate, and if that signifies that we haven't moved as far beyond gender politics as we think.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I completely agree that it was a strategic decision. I don't know that she would have made a bad decision by choosing a woman, right? I think that is the box that a lot of people sort of put her in. And I think that, she didn't want to take that risk. But I think that is how we change political landscapes, right? We change political landscapes by challenging the current one. And so I don't necessarily think it was a bad or good decision, right? But I will say that in terms of Governor Walz specifically, I think he's a really fascinating candidate to be vice president in terms of the way that he displays his masculinity, because I think that is such an interesting conversation in politics today, and especially on the Republican side, right? So political scientists often, we think of the Republican Party as being like masculine, right? Voters conceptualize the Republican Party as this more masculine party. And you see candidates leaning into that, even Republican women candidates kind of leaning into that, right? With Nikki Haley running for president with her, finish them, quote. And so, I think that having Governor Walz, who is someone who is compassionate, empathetic, right, challenges this idea of toxic masculinity, and having him potentially debate J.D. Vance, I think will be a really fascinating way to challenge this concept of masculinity at the highest levels of office. And so, the Republican Party is already, putting out hashtags like Tampon Tim, and that is really backfiring, right? The idea that we shouldn't be, advocating for tampons in restrooms, right? Or that we shouldn't be, supporting women's rights, women's reproductive rights, all of that stuff. And I think he is a good candidate to challenge that. I will also just mention that I think the camo hat with the Harris walls, right? That is very similar to, to Chapel Roan hat is fascinating, right? Because it is that, I love the memes that are, the rise of the Midwest princess. And that, I think, also challenges this concept of masculinity, and I think reaches out to younger voters.
Yeah. That was our conversation about women in politics and what it means that the second woman in American history likely will lead the Democratic presidential ticket in 2024. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we are going to revisit a conversation about the 50th anniversary of a Supreme Court ruling that ended forced busing as a tool for school integration. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson. It's our weekly recap show. I'm here with Carrie Jr. II, our producer.
And weekly recap beatmaker.
Yeah, that's right.
Manifested.
Or at least potential beatmaker.
Okay,
right?
That was being accurate. Okay.
In our last look back this week, we revisit a 50-year-old controversy from right here in Detroit and Michigan that reached the U.S. Supreme Court. At one point, they decided that in order to integrate schools in Metro Detroit, you needed to put kids on buses and send them far from home in some cases to have them attend other schools with kids who weren't like them. And of course, there were challenges to this. It got to the U.S. Supreme Court. They said, turns out this is not okay. And we had a conversation about what that ruling meant here in Detroit and Michigan at the time, but what it's meant over 50 years, what things we lost out on, what things we have not been able to do to not only achieve more school integration, but achieve better outcomes, especially for African-American kids who were kind of left behind in underfunded and under-resourced schools as a result of this.
It always reminds me of our conversation with Gary Orfield, who is the law professor at UCLA, and his research that found that we are almost as segregated as we were when Brown v. Board was ruled. And so this case itself seems like it feeds into the reasons why we are in the predicament that we're in now. This court case is one of many cases throughout the later 20th century that limited integration efforts. When we had Robin Vincent, who had been a guest for us before, who's a reporter for Chalkbeat Detroit, who wrote this piece in Chalkbeat, looking back at Milliken v. Bradley, and she joined us on the show. And we also had Ken Coleman, who's a journalist and Detroit historian. And we were joined by Amber Ariano, though she's not in the segment that you'll hear. She's the executive director of the Education Trust. It's a nonpartisan research and advocacy organization that specializes in education.
Ken, I want to start with you. Milliken v. Bradley is decided in the early 70s, but if we wanted to really tell this story and really talk about what that ruling meant, you got to go back much further in our community and really talk about the presence of African Americans here in Detroit and Southeast Michigan.
Absolutely. What we know about our region's history, and certainly Detroit's history proper, is that in a couple different waves, the Great Migration brings African Americans, largely from southern states, to Detroit in the 19-teens and 20s. And then there's a second wave that really sort of happens in the 1940s. African Americans come here looking for, better economic opportunities, housing and education. So much so that the decade of the 1940s, Detroit's African American population doubles from about 149,000 people to about 300,000 people, and that's where you see certainly the baby boomer generation, particularly as it relates to the African American community, becomes a majority of Detroit public schools as students by 1963. That creates opportunities, obviously opportunities for African Americans to go to city schools, but only certain city schools and certain parts of the city. I mean, we can think about in our lifetime, Stephen, I remember I know people who, African Americans who really helped to integrate schools like the old Finney High School on the northeast side, or Cooley High School in the northwest side. Large swaths of the city, Robin, as your great reporting has indicated, large swaths of the city had very few African American students up until this time of Bradley versus Milliken.
Yeah, and that segregation in these schools reflected the segregation in housing. It was because you had...
There's a clear correlation there, as you pointed out earlier. African Americans largely come to this city, many of them living on the Lower East Side in the old Black Bottom neighborhood. Some of them end up on the what we call the Old West Side, the Northwestern High School area. And then you see some migration on the Northeast Side in the Conant Gardens and the like. But there are lots of neighborhoods where black kids don't go to school with white kids because of race discrimination that was carried out in the real estate industry, and even pushback in neighborhoods, in city neighborhoods throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s.
So by the time we get to Milliken v. Bradley, there's a lot of different ideas about what this segregation means, whether it is something we ought to focus on and get rid of, and how to do it. Talk about some of those diverse viewpoints and the fact that a lot of them were within the black community itself. This was not a universally accepted idea that we had to integrate school.
Absolutely. You had very different voices. The Detroit branch NAACP, and coming after Brown versus Board in 1954, has this idea, the Detroit branch NAACP has this idea and fights throughout the 1960s for, either busing kids from one community to another, or certainly striking down policies at the local school board level that help perpetuate race discrimination. So you had the NAACP saying integration. And by the way, busing can be part of that. But then you had others in the African American community, strident, more nationalistic voices, who were saying, well, we don't want to go to school with white kids. We just want the same resources that white kids are getting. It's not that I want my kid to go to Finney. I'm fine with my kid going to Northern. Northern High, but I want Northern High to have the same resources that Finney does. And so that happens throughout the 60s. And even young people get involved. In 1966, a couple thousand students march out of Northern High School, largely African-American high school at that time. They march out largely because they realize that they don't have the same resources. They don't have the same textbooks. Even the physical plant, even the buildings are older than some of the schools and outlining areas of the city. And so you had a divergence of voices. Traditional civil rights community, the Black Power movement that's becoming more and more impactful, and even students at various schools are protesting, walking out sometimes of classrooms, making the argument that we want equity, we want an equitable deliverance of resources,
and this idea of busing, that's the way to achieve it. That inspires its own really crazy backlash. I mean, I have seen the pictures and read the stories about what people do when this gets suggested. People were not just upset. I mean, they were really angry, and it led to some violence.
No question. And Robin points this out in her reporting. Imagine a white male federal court judge saying, I'm handing down an order where there will be cross-district busing in 54 school districts, pretty much all of southeastern Michigan, or certainly Metro Detroit. That's something that just be candid. Some white folks lost their minds. You could go as far north as Pontiac. Irene McCabe, African American. White, happens to be white. She certainly is part of a movement that pushes back against a order that would create white kids going to school with black kids up in Pontiac. She's joined by a guy named L. Brooks Patterson. I think we all know his name.
He was the lawyer. He was the lawyer representing them, right?
Representing Irene McCabe. And what we know in August of 1971, school buses were bombed. Didn't have young people on them, but buses that were intended to bus black kids to white schools. We know that the Ku Klux Klan bombed buses on the eve of the start of school in 1971. That's a very extreme reaction to the conversation that was going on about busing kids from one community to another.
Yeah.
I mean, I even saw historical photos of little kids holding signs that were attacking Judge Stephen Roth. Things like, Judge Roth is a child molester. I mean... Yeah, the attacks went deep and personal.
Yeah, and a little bit about Roth. He had served as the state's attorney general in the early 1950s. He was a John F. Kennedy appointed federal court judge, and obviously was leading the case. The case was in his courtroom, Bradley versus Milliken. Dies of a fatal heart attack just before the U.S. Supreme Court ruling.
I spoke with a legal scholar who knew him and feels that it was connected to Milliken versus Bradley, and said that it just brought him a great deal of anxiety. And he described Judge Roth not as being an activist judge, as just being a judge who was trying to very much rule on a basis of constitutionality, especially given what we understood about Brown versus Board of Education. And this scholar said, he was never the same after that.
Yeah, and what we don't always point out, this is a 5-4 decision,
Right.
U.S. Supreme Court decision. So it wasn't a slam dunk, if you will. It could have easily gone the other way. And Stephen, you and I are about the same age. I mean, I'm entering the first grade right after the 1974 U.S. Supreme Court decision. I sometimes think about and imagine if this Northwest Detroit kid, black kid, myself, if I had been bused to Birmingham Groves or West Bloomfield High, what would that look like?
Right. Your whole life might be different.
Might be totally different, but we are part of a generation that has lived and seen that. You and I were kid news reporters covering school board meetings in the 90s about the time of Proposal A.
Yes.
And another conversation that, sort of talks about equities and inequities, or at least tries to approach that. So 50 years has been very, very turbulent on this issue.
And we haven't made a lot of progress. I mean,
unfortunately, not.
Either on the integration front or the outcome front, or the equitable funding front. Robin, you had a chance to talk with some of the people who were part of this plan. It's one of my favorite parts of your story, in fact, is these people who were part of this experiment, at least for a short time. Tell us about some of them.
Yes. So I spoke with some folks who were a part of the busing that was happening within the city of Detroit, right? Because it never expanded further than that. Right. Exactly. I spoke with a woman named Nancy Jennings. She grew up in Southwest Detroit. She's biracial. She was bused from her mostly black school to an all-white one just about 4 miles away. Now, her experience challenges what we understand today about segregated schools.
I was in a reverse experience where we were the black kids in a well-resourced school. However, our principal got it that way. It was well-resourced. And we were getting bused to a school with white kids that had fewer resources than we did into a shabbier school.
So that's like the upside down version
right.
of what we're talking about, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's one of the things that I think is most interesting about race and history when you talk about it in this country is that because it's such a perverse dynamic in our culture, it produces all kinds of inequalities, right? And they aren't always the predictable ones. It's almost like it ricochets around and creates chaos that results in experiences that you wouldn't necessarily think would happen.
Absolutely. And Nancy said, she faced bullying in school at her old school that was mostly black. And because some of those same bullies from her old school were bused with her to the new school, she continued to face bullying, but she said it wasn't really from the white students that she went to school with.
Yeah. You talked with another person who was bused and who found this experience to be, I guess, more profound and that it had a real effect on his life.
Yes. Dale Seaton. I was able to track him down while he was camping somewhere out in the wilderness in northern Michigan. He grew up in a neighborhood in Southwest Detroit that wasn't too far from Nancy's. His dad was a teacher, and his dad pushed him to be part of the school district's integration efforts. So Dale left his mostly black school for one that was largely Hispanic and Latino and remains so today. And, he wasn't mad about it.
I became friends with the kids who were bused. They became my lifetime friends because their parents were much like my parents to see an opportunity. So I had like-minded kids on the bus with me. They weren't perfect kids, but they're like my brothers. Literally everybody on that bus, I'm still friends with.
And so Dale eventually returned to that school many years later and ended up working as a substitute teacher there. He said he really felt the significance of that work given the lack of black male educators.
Wow. I mean, it's such an interesting outcome from the weirdness of the way we deal with racism and the history of racism in this country. That was our conversation about the 50th anniversary of Milliken v. Bradley and what it means for racial integration in schools. Really diverse week of shows, Carrie, all over the place.
Not as diverse as our schools.
That's right.
Apparently.
Or more diverse than our schools.
Right. I'm sorry. More diverse. That's what I should have said. Yeah.
Yeah.
More diverse than our. Dang it. Now it doesn't cut the way I wanted it to. Oh, well.
That's all right.
I thought it was a good week of shows. Really glad we were able to touch on the big news of the week with the election. I imagine that's going to keep happening. That's
gonna happen over and over in the next couple of weeks. We're getting close to the convention. Mm-hmm. Then it's going to be about the debates, and then it's going to be time to vote. That'll do it for us on Created Equal. Be sure to listen to our recent episodes at WDET.org, and we would love if you would subscribe to our podcast, where you can leave us a rating or a review. Created Equal is produced by Carrie Jr. II and David Lyons. Our audio editing is done by Connor Anderson, and the music is by Sam Bobian. Created Equal is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University.